I remember being face down on that carpet on the platform, and the first thought was, this is real. And then the next thought was, what else did they lie to me about all my life? I was having an encounter with a power that has the power to touch my physical body and the insides of me, because it wasn't just my flesh that was being impacted. And I mean, the flesh reacting was just a reaction to my entire being encountering the power of God. 4 days ago, I didn't believe in getting slain in the spirit and falling down, and the power of God physically makes it so that you can't stand on your feet. That's why people fall down. And if that exists, then the power for immediate healing may exist too. So why not do what he says? And when he prayed, it was like a light switch. 3.5 years of excruciating pain in my back. And it was like somebody turned the switch off. There was, some people say they get this warm feeling or whatever. It was literally like shutting the power off of pain. I mean, no denying something, a power struck me. I'm Rob Malone. I grew up in Pennsylvania, here in America, and that's where I stayed for 40 years. And now I'm a resident of Tampa, Florida, and in ministry, where I never thought I'd see myself for a lot of years. From earliest memories, I was raised up in church in a Christian family. My father would even fill in for the minister sometimes when he was absent from the pulpit. And we were highly involved. And when I say highly involved, I mean, in the beginning, we went to a Baptist church. And we also went to the school. And my parents were part of the bus ministry and the van ministry for the school and the church. So as a kid, all we had was church. I have 2 older sisters, one that's a year older, one that's 4 years older. And our home was disciplined, but not like overboard, not tyrannical or anything. And my father's a good man, loving heart, loving guy. And my mother was the one that sometimes would have flare-ups of anger because there were 3 of us. And but all in all, it wasn't strife. It was a good childhood. Peace. It wasn't like some households with fighting all the time. And we had almost every evening, we had devotions at home. That was if we didn't have church services. When I was very young in the church, somewhere around kindergarten age, so 4 or 5 years old, I did pray the prayer and give my life to Christ, and I got saved. And being raised in that denomination, they also believed in once saved, always saved. That'll come into a greater perspective for you whenever I tell you the rest of my testimony. But yes, we have grace and mercy, but not the way that they preach it. And but I was saved whenever I was very young, 4 or 5 years old, like I said. And growing up, I had a good fear of the Lord and loved Jesus, loved God. And but I really, as a child, you're just a product of your environment and what you hear and see. And, I got spanked by my parents for doing things wrong, which isn't a bad thing. That's, there's a nerve in your backside that helps you remember things. And your parents, when they engage that, you tend to remember not to do those things anymore. The problem was I was raised a pastor who would get angry, red in the face, beat on the pulpit, screaming at people to repent. And it was between your father and your first pastor, it gives you the picture of who God is. And I heard a lot of preaching on Old Testament scriptures. So the picture I had of God, even as a child, was that he was just up in heaven waiting for me to mess up so he could punish me. And maybe it was because I got into a lot of trouble and I got spankings. So the two in a child's mind came together. But I just had the wrong view of God. I didn't see him like a loving father as a child. I saw him as an all-powerful God who was just waiting to punish me if I messed up. And it wasn't until much later in life that I got that picture renewed and changed and found out exactly what God is and who he is and his nature. As kids growing up, my sisters and I, there was a church camp that we attended in the summertime, and then they also had 2 little weekends that they would have in spring and fall, and we attended those. So it was nice to be around other youth who were involved in church. But then I went to Christian school until I was in 8th grade, and then I went to public school. And as you're starting to get older, in teen years, you enter those teen years, I think there's more people speaking into your lives, and if you're not careful about who you allow to speak into your life, they'll start speaking perspectives that have you questioning your parents, questioning your faith, questioning God. And there were a lot of things that we couldn't do as a family. I mean, we didn't go on vacations very often. And even sports. I knew that the demand with having one vehicle and having limited funds, I just never asked to be in any sports because I knew it was too much of a financial drain and time drain on my parents. I did, however, get into martial arts whenever I was young, and it took me from being angry and volatile to being almost a pacifist. And then later on, whenever I walked away from God, it was kind of a mix. So as I progressed through my teenage years, I started looking at family life and everything that was happening with us. And I saw that my parents served God like crazy. And as a teen, it was like I was looking at the world, and it looked like all these people were going and having fun and doing all the things that I was told that we couldn't do. And the influences around me, I started compromising. And that's actually where I know now that a spirit of rebellion was able to take root. So I was doing things that I knew weren't acceptable. Not even that it was sin in itself. It was sin because I was disobeying my parents. But the actions I was taking, you could debate whether or not those things were sin, but I knew my parents would not allow me to do it. So it's rebellion and sinful because I'm disobedient. So as I progressed, I still wanted to do things for God. And when I was 16, the summer right before I turned 16, I went on a youth ministry team, a youth ministry program for the entire summer. It was 10 weeks. I spent around the United States and Canada. We did puppetry and drama and singing and evangelism on the street. And I was incredibly happy. And I came back, and there were a few things that occurred. One of them was the death of a pastor of our church. When he died, he was such a kind man. Like I don't even know how that triggered me, like to shake my fist at heaven and be angry with God. He was kind of like a grandfather figure to me. I started looking at our family life, and I didn't see personally reward and blessing for my parents. Like when I look at my parents' life, I didn't see reward and blessing for all the time that they put in to serving God. I didn't see any tangible reward now. And yes, I understood all the scripture behind laying up treasures in heaven, and everything we're doing is for an eternal reward. But there is scripture that says you'll have a reward in this life. And I didn't see any reward on it. So I was convincing myself, well, if these other people that are living with no rules have nicer things, more time to have fun and do all the things they want to do, and they're not serving God, and we are serving God, and there's nothing good, beneficial now, like, I just didn't understand it. So I decided that when I could make my own decision about going to church, that was not something I was going to put my time to. My thought was, I can still have a relationship with God, and I love God. He lives in my heart. I said a prayer when I was 5 years old, and so I'm saved, but I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Like, that was just my mentality in that situation. And it's never a jumping off a cliff. It's sliding down a hill when you start compromising and deciding you're going to live however you want to live. Because there are some things in the beginning that I would have never thought I would do, that within a year or two, I was doing things that I never would have thought I would do. I graduated high school when I was 17, and I was already working almost full-time hours when I was 15 years old. So even after school, I would walk down. There was a produce store, a grocery store, and I did all the produce, and I also did catering with them. And so from the time I was 15 in high school, I was working 30 plus hours a week, and then sometimes I would, work more than was allowed by law. Whenever we did catering jobs, sometimes 16 hours. But I was a hard worker. I was, raised to do that. We didn't have a farm, but we lived next to a farm, and I grew up helping on that farm. So you get a work ethic, and my father had a fantastic work ethic. When I went to college after high school, I still was working to pay for my own college. So I had jammed 18 credit hours at college into 3 days, and I worked 5 days full time. So I would be school Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Thursday night, I would go to work, and I'd work full-time hours until I came back on Tuesday. So all work through Monday and then drive back to school. During all that time, there was just no time for church. And when I did go to church, it was just to make my parents happy. It wasn't because I wanted to be there. And it seemed like after I came back from that youth ministry trip, somewhere in that year between age 16 and 17, I didn't see any value in going to church anymore. Most of the people that were around me, I saw they were just hypocrites. And they came to church, they listened to the same preaching I did. They didn't live that way. We had a couple of teenage girls in the church get pregnant from boys in the church, and it was like, I don't see any difference between these people in the church and people outside the church. So for me, it was like, I just didn't see the value in it. So I just stopped going to church. And so I didn't really have a desire to read the Bible either. It's just that I had memorized a lot of scripture, so I had scripture in me. And once I was away from everyone in the church and all that, the only influence I had were people of the world. So when I got to college and I'm living on campus, even though it was a dry campus, I was drinking a lot, heavily. But it wasn't like I started drinking then. The first time I had alcohol, I was 13 years old at a birthday party that my parents didn't let us go spend nights at people's homes that they didn't know. But this was a daytime birthday party, and it was the first year I was in public school, and I didn't like the alcohol when I tried it, but I did try beer that day and hard liquor. And then when I was 15 years old, we were staying overnight. The whole family was staying overnight at my cousin's house. And when the adults were upstairs sleeping, we were all sleeping in the downstairs bedrooms. And my cousin had bottles of alcohol, and I actually I had never consumed much alcohol before that. But that night, when I was 15 years old, I went into alcohol shock, and I stopped breathing 4 times. So I'm downstairs, not breathing, and my sister is slapping me until I wake back up. And, you know, vomiting. So I would stop breathing. She would smack me. I'd wake up, and then I'd start throwing up. And so our parents are in the house, and I'm literally half dead downstairs from drinking. But when I was 17 at college, it was around. It was there all the time, everywhere. And I shared an apartment with 3 other guys, and our apartment was one of 4 in that complex, and then the complex had another 20 quads like ours, where there's 4 apartments. And there was never an end to people having parties. And so as I was trying to educate myself with higher education, I was drinking all night long. And it got to the point where I was 130 pounds and consuming about 1.5 liters of alcohol without passing out. So just within that first year of college, I drank so much that, like, if I would have done that day one, it would have killed me. But the tolerance I had built up, just to tell you how far I went, how quickly. But I had no other influences in my life. But God was still showing up in dreams and visions during that whole time. I mean, it was really a crazy time. The first time I can ever remember having dreams or visions of things was, I don't know, I was 6 or 7 years old. And I mean, vivid, apocalyptic type Battle of Armageddon dreams. We didn't watch movies, HBO, anything like that. I mean, my parents, it was like the ABC Sunday Night Special was the only movies we had watched. You know, it was literally listening to Christian programming, listening to Christian music as a child, and watching shows that were clean shows. I mean, my parents didn't tolerate anything that was the least bit compromised. So I didn't have any influences that would have been where something came in and I'm seeing it in my mind when I sleep. It was literally like angels and demons and doing battle, and I thought I was crazy. But it also, that's where, whenever I talked earlier about being volatile as a child, I think because I didn't want to express it to my parents and it kept happening, it was like I had this rage inside of me. And but that was the first time. But then whenever I was at college, I mean, quite literally, I had been drinking one night and I went to bed, and 2 hours after I went to bed, I wake up from a dream where I could see my parents standing at a funeral, a graveside service for a funeral. And I knew that it was the man from the hospital that my father shared a room with. My father had had a pulmonary embolism whenever I was 14 years old. So he had a blood clot in his leg that went through his heart and into his lung. And they thought he was going to die when I was 14. And he shared a room with this guy. And when I'm at college, 17 years old, I know, I can't see the guy's face. I just know that it's him in the casket. And I can see my parents standing at the graveside, and it's pouring down rain. And I looked out the window, and it was sunshine, 10 a.m., right? And I had been drinking all night till morning. And when the sun came up is when I went to sleep, and 10 a.m. I'm waking up from this dream. And 2 days later, my mother called me, and she said, "Hey, I just wanted to tell you that," I forget his name, but this guy passed away. And I said, "Oh, I know." And it just jumped out at me. I said, "I know." And she goes, "What do you mean you know?" I said, "Was the funeral on Wednesday?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Was it raining when you were at the graveside?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Yeah, I saw it in a dream." It was like God was still showing up in the midst of me just destroying everything I had been brought up to know was right and wrong. I would have dreams about situations that years later I would have the conversation with people and I would know what they were going to say next because I had already seen the situation. And this is not stuff that you tell people because some people just think you're insane. I don't know how else to say it, but you feel crazy whenever you're sitting having a conversation with somebody and a sentence comes out of your mouth and it triggers a memory. And I'm not talking deja vu. I'm talking it triggers a memory of an actual dream where you saw a conversation play out. And then the next, 3 times of volley, you already know what they're going to say and what you're going to say. And the exact words are spoken in the exact setting. And I had things like that happen. One was with a boss of mine, and we were in a building. In the dream, it was a building that I'd never been in before, never seen the inside of this room. And we're working in this building years later. And as soon as he asked a question, that's when the dream came back to me of standing in that room with him. And I had the dream before I ever started working for him. So I didn't even know his face or the room. So it's like you just dismiss dreams because the person you see isn't even in your life. So, but it was stuff like that I would have. So it was like God showing me he was real and me just dismissing it. And they were always some type of warning. That building, I encountered serious demonic activity, like incredible. So I had to, we restored and maintained all types of flooring and carpets. So, and it was a huge building right on the river in Pittsburgh. I had that situation the first night we were there, and it was all of us. And I had to go back several times to finish cleaning that whole building. And there's nobody in the building. I'm there. I mean, I'm the one with the keys and the codes and get in. There's nobody in the building. And when I went to the lower level to clean the carpets, it's kind of an open workspace with lots of desks and everything. So I'm just cleaning all the carpet that's exposed. And my machine was sitting about halfway down through this building, so it was almost 80 feet away from me. And I kept seeing some things, more than one. But it was like a shadowy person in the room. But every time I would see it out of the corner of my eye and look toward it, I couldn't see it whenever I was staring at it. And I was like, just letting an empty building play tricks on your mind. And but this thing, quite literally, there's 10-foot ceilings in the place. It looked like it was 9 feet tall. And it had happened, I don't know, 6 or 7 times after I entered the building. Every time I'm trying to work, I keep seeing these things move around the room, and then one stopped next to the machine and just stopped, and I could see it. And I kind of threw out my arms because I honestly couldn't believe that I was actually seeing something. And I looked and I said, "Hey, get away from my machine." And when I said get away from my machine, that thing disappeared, and I felt hands clamp down on my head, like clamp down on my head. It freaked me out, right? So I packed up everything and got it upstairs. And after the moment that I spoke that, I could feel these hands squeezing my head. And every time I would walk out the door with equipment to go out to my van, as soon as I walked out the door, I couldn't feel them. But as soon as I walked back in the door, I could feel them back on my head. So, but every time I had visions like that, it was some sort of warning or God telling me about something in the situation. But incidentally, I called up one of my coworkers. I said, "Hey, you know that new contract we got?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, you can have it." It was like, "You can have it. It pays really good, and if you can handle it, I'd appreciate it." He was like, "What do you mean?" Because I didn't give away jobs. I didn't give up money. And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, oh yeah, I'm sure. I'm never going back in that building. And he made me tell him why. And he just laughed it off and thought that I was crazy. But, there is scripture that says, Jesus I know and Paul you know, but who are you, right? And essentially, I was calling myself a Christian and I was living like everybody else in the world did. I have no spiritual power from the good side, right? And here's this thing that whenever I say, get away from my machine with authority, I didn't have any. And I found out real quick that I didn't have any authority because there was nothing I could do in that situation that would get these hands off of my head that I couldn't even see. So, that was just a moment where, I believe God knew exactly what was going to happen that day. And that later on, it would actually key me in that there is spiritual powers. And if you are not empowered spiritually, then you're just going to be a victim of the one that wants to take you out. I'm going to tell you what, no joke. When I felt the hands on my head, it was like every hair on my body stood up. And the feeling was absurd, just really unnatural. It really was. And not that I'm trying to glorify the demonic, but that's what happened. And I was not spiritually in a place where I could defend myself. So I just knew that I'm never going back in that building. So there are some things that the Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. There are some things that you get in you so much that they're like the no compromise zone. So it's all the other things that, and everybody has a different spot where it's no compromise. Like if you want to compromise, you're going to compromise in some fashion, but you think it's only going to be this much. But there are some things that it's like, there is a line in the sand that you're not going to cross. And there were certain things in my life. I didn't take the Lord's name in vain. I mean, that was, growing up in Pennsylvania, there's actually an evangelist. He says that West Virginia, he said, there'll be somebody with a cigarette in one hand and a whiskey in the other, but you take the Lord's name in vain and they're going to smack you in the mouth. Okay? So there are certain lines you don't cross. And so there were still things that I would not compromise on, but there was a lot of stuff that I just kind of lived however I wanted. So from 17 on, I was drinking heavily. I was kind of doing whatever I wanted and running around, wine, women, and song. And through that process, when I was 17, I flipped and rolled a car, crushed a nerve in my neck. I was an insomniac for several months. Like I would be up for 4 days at a time, sleep for 20 minutes, and be back up because I just had excruciating pain all the time, shooting up my neck into my head. And so that was right before I turned 18, or right before I turned 19. And I was still working more than full-time hours. I was working like crazy. And I couldn't sleep. So even though I had slowed down drinking because I couldn't party anymore because I wasn't at college and I was actually working a job, a real job, I spent a year and a half in college and drinking the whole time. I mean, like heavily drinking. I was partying and drinking heavily and trying to still perform in class and work a full-time job at the same time. But I was, doing my best at drinking, not all the other things. And, my best accomplishments came from that. But there were many fights, get into many fights. And, we won't even get into that, but just ridiculous things where the one night I had no clue what had happened at the end of the fight, but there was a car outside that was dented all the way around And my roommate said, "You go match your head up to the dents on the outside of that car. That's how your fight ended." So it was me getting my head slammed off of a car repeatedly, and it was just self-destructive. I mean, everything was self-destructive. I ended up having to work a real job getting out of college after the 3 semesters, and so I couldn't drink like I did in college, but it didn't mean that I wouldn't binge drink when I could drink, and I'd had to go back home, but that's also the time whenever I got my first house with some roommates. So I could drink then whenever I wanted, but then I started drinking more again because I couldn't sleep from having the crushed nerve. I was an insomniac. So I was living at my parents' house after the car crash because of not being able to afford the house with my friend. And I had a bottle of vodka hidden in the closet so I could sleep. So I would go and get tomato juice out of my mom's fridge and put about this much tomato juice in a glass and fill it the rest of the way with vodka. And I would drink it down, and then I could sleep for 2 hours. So I didn't want to take drugs to sleep. I didn't want painkillers and all that because I didn't want to be addicted to something. But I was using something even worse to try and medicate myself to the point that I could sleep. And that even then it was only a couple hours of sleep. So from 19 to 21, whenever in the U.S. that's legal drinking age, by the time I hit 21, I really didn't drink anymore. By the time I was legally allowed, I would rarely drink. During that time from 19 to 23, I didn't have a lot of time to drink. But when I had spare time, I would drink, and not for the social aspect. It was, I wanted the feeling that it gave me to be drunk. It was, it was not I'm having a glass of wine with dinner. It was, I'm going to drink as much as I can tonight because it's the only night that I can drink. So, but I was, during that time too, I went back to doing catering. So I was working for a catering company, and there's always alcohol. I mean, there's always an abundance of alcohol. And the food service industry is actually one of the top 5 industries for substance abuse, alcohol and drugs. So everybody drank. And we would drink while we worked because we're serving other people alcohol and we're drinking the alcohol. And then after we cleaned up, there was lots of alcohol left. So we would sit around together and drink because we didn't need to go to a bar. We had everything right there. And so it was just like I was in an industry where it was convenient to drink and work at the same time. And so that didn't help matters at all. God has a funny way of correcting us sometimes. And at one point in my life, I looked at my mother when I was 19, as a matter of fact. I looked at my mother and I said, I'm never getting married. I'm never having kids. And so, today I can smile and laugh about that because it shows how little I knew. But that's what came out of my mouth at 19 years old. And in April of 1999, I got married to Rachel. And she and I had first met when we were 12 or 13 years old at summer camp. And we had corresponded back and forth here and there. And then whenever I was in my 20s, I reached out. We dated, and then we started living together. And she was told for a few years that she really couldn't have kids, that it would be difficult for her. But as soon as we got married, she got pregnant, and Graham was born. My oldest son was born in February of the year 2000. And Logan was born in 2003, January 2003. But I was completely living in the world. Like I said, when we got married, I was working for the catering company, so I was just lost. We would go to church here and there because it seemed like the right thing to do, and well, that's the way we were raised, and some of our family members went to church, but mainly it was like to check a box to make yourself feel good. Oh yeah, I still love God, and I'm hopeful that I'm going to make it to heaven. And it's like anything. If you're afraid to cut a relationship off, you'll just keep on being in touch here and there. And that's kind of what it was with going to church. It was, hey God, I'm still here. Do you remember me? And you know, ultimately, it's you're raised where you know heaven's real and hell's real, and you're like, hey, this is me. I don't want to go to hell. I came to church today. I mean, the rest of my life, you know, 168 hours in a week, and 166 of them, I'm not living for God, not thinking about God. But on Sunday morning, I'll give him a couple hours. And it was more for me to feel good about the rest of my week than it was anything else. So that was the first marriage. The kids came along. We had moved to Boston. 36 hours after we got married, we moved to Boston. And 4 months later, we were back because she was pregnant and she didn't want to be having a child in another state. So we were back in Pittsburgh. And after almost 7 years of marriage, she...
What was the marriage like? You know, did you guys get along? What was the fundamental of the relationship? If it didn't work out, why didn't it work out? How did it go? Was it uphill, downhill, uphill? Or what was it like?
After 2 years of marriage, so we lived together for 2 years, but then after 2 years of marriage, even before Logan arrived, our marriage, you could tell neither one of us were very happy. But we had also, neither one of us really wanted to divorce. And for me, divorce wasn't an option. Like, that was one of those line in the sand things I won't cross. If I got married, I'm married. And it didn't matter if I was miserable. You know, my parents are still married to this day. This year will be like 54 years of marriage for them. And it was just something that I wasn't going to do. If I had to be miserable and try and make things work, then that's what I would do, especially because we had a child at the time, and I knew that. And but I remember speaking it out to someone that after 2 years of marriage, if I wouldn't have had children already, I probably would have divorced. But it was because we had children together, and I wasn't going to do that to my son. And then Logan came along, and so thought things would get better, and they just were amplified. Children don't solve marital problems. You have to pour into children, and so you need a strong marriage to pour into your kids. Having a child is not going to bring you together. It's just adding another thing into the mix. But that was our fault for not knowing how to communicate, and I think there were just things that we both did that were selfish young people things. Like, we were too selfish in our own wills to be able to be the spouse to the other person that we needed to be. And anybody, and I'm not trying to condemn anyone out there, but there's two people in a marriage. So to say it was all their fault is very arrogant, because there were two of you in the relationship. So if it didn't work, it's because the two of you didn't work, not one. So in March of 2007, I should say first, we were living in my best friend's house, raising the boys, because he was working a job where he was out of town for 3.5 weeks out of a month. And so we were living there, not paying rent, and all we had to pay were the utilities. So we paid all the bills, and he owned the house. And he stayed in the basement apartment for, the 1 week where he was in each month. And then he was getting married in 2005, so I had to buy a house. And 2005 was the first time that I had logged on my computer, and I saw that there was searches for divorce attorneys. And I never brought it up, but I saw that from 2005 she was seeking divorce attorneys and expert help. And so we bought a house, and we moved to Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, and the new house didn't make anything better. It just suited the purpose, and we started making the home. But in March of 2007, she said she wanted to leave. She had already found another apartment, and there was no stopping her. I suggested going to therapy, going to actual counselor, and the things that were said, like I asked key questions to find out how to move forward, because the law in Pennsylvania is that if you separate, even if you don't want a divorce, if the other person leaves and they're gone for 2 years, then you can't stop a divorce from going through. It's just that you end up making them wait 2 years instead of signing papers and just being done. So I knew that if she left 2 years from that day, there's no way I could stop a divorce anyway. So I started asking key questions. She said she would go to counseling. We went for the first session, and when we came back, I asked her, I said, did you go because I asked you, or because you actually want things to get better? And she said, I went because you asked me. And it was maybe 2 weeks later, she hadn't scheduled another appointment to go back, and I went, and I asked her a key question, and I said, am I someone that you love, or just someone that you share a house and kids with? And her response was, honestly, the latter. Honestly. And, the way people say things indicates how they feel. And the second honestly was the salt in the wound there. But it was at that point that I knew that there was no stopping. She had already gotten the apartment. So I helped her get it furnished so the boys would have the least amount of problems of transitioning, and signed papers so that they wouldn't have to go through all the things that happen with divorce and custody. So if we could agree on all that stuff, it would keep them from having to go through all the court hearings. And that's what we did. She signed the papers, she left. But quite literally, 3 days, so I had been married for almost 7 years, and right about the time that we had gotten married and moved to Boston and moved back, the job that I got when we moved back, I was still in when she left. And so she left, but I told her, I said, if you sign in the papers, I said, I'm keeping the house, I'm keeping the cars, I'm keeping the kids. I said, if you want to move out, nobody's telling you you have to, but if you want to leave, then you can leave, but everything else is staying right here. And she still wanted to leave. So when she left, 3 days later, I got fired from my job that I'd had for 7 years. So here I am. My wife just left. I get fired from my job, and I have 2 little boys that are 4 and 7, and I have no job. So it wasn't the best time of my life. And I would have told you I was a Christian at that point, because I had said a prayer, and I believed that, I'm on my way to heaven because I said a prayer, not because of living the way God wants me to live. And but I wasn't. I would attend church sometimes, but it still was the same way. But the interesting thing was that my parents, on my behalf, reached out to a minister that, when the pastor of our church, when I was 17, when he died, there were several pastors that had come, and they were trying to decide who they were going to have be the new pastor. And there was a young guy that he was a fantastic pastor, and the elders of the church just pushed him out. And it was not the way they did things. The church wanted to hire him, but the elders didn't want him. And so what they did was just not even right in the way they pushed him out. And so he asked, because my parents told him what was going on, he asked if he could come and sit and have coffee with me. And so we're sitting in the yard, and I said, he goes, you really need to be in church. And I said, why do I need that? I said, it's full of hypocrites. I said, look what they did to you. Because, it was the church that we were attending whenever I said, these elders that are supposed to be Christians, the way they treated you, I was like, how are they any different than the people in the world? And what do I need that in my life for? I can have a relationship with God without going to church. And, which is partially true. However, he said what I already knew. And he looked at me and he said, the Bible says, forsake not the gathering of yourselves together. He says, it means never stop gathering together with other people who are believers. And I said, okay. I said, I'll find a church, right? So it was at that point, if it wouldn't have been for him, I probably wouldn't even considered returning on a regular basis to go to a church. And what he had said to me was, look, people are people and God is God. You can't judge God by people that want you to believe they're godly. So he said, there are going to be hypocrites. There are going to be people that don't live what they preach. But it was like, that doesn't give you the right not to go to church when God told you not to stop going to a church. So he was the one that pushed, and it was a gentle push, and it took a little while for me to do it, but I actually was a person of my word. So when I told him I would find a church, I started looking for a church and trying different ones out. So that was 2007. So there are things in your life that are good, that push you in a direction, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's God's perfect will for your life. It's just kind of pushing you in a direction. And so Rhoda was my second wife. After Rachel had left, I ended up reconnecting with her. And Rhoda was a girl that I dated before connecting with Rachel. And so in that 19 to 21-year-old range is when Rhoda and I dated. And it was a completely flesh relationship back then. I actually met her at a Christmas party where both of us were drinking, and it was, the original relationship was all carnal. I tell you that. And we didn't really work back then. But now she had been married, and her husband left her. And so when we ended up running back into one another, both of our spouses had just left. And I'm not going to say it was God that put us together. However, when our dates in the beginning, we ran into one another at a grocery store. And because she's buying groceries, I have to buy groceries for the kids, right? And so our dates were setting up to shop together, to go to the grocery store together, so we didn't have to actually go on dates, right? And so one of the things that she said to me, it was like this random comment that actually is what pushed me to really find a church. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you know, out of all the people that I dated, you're the only person who ever invited me to church." And so even when I was fully in the world, I actually invited her to church. And so that was something like, I stood out from everyone else, not because of what I thought was what made me me. But at the time, that's not what made me me, but that's what made me stand out to her, was that I invited her to church when no one else she dated did. And so we actually started, while we were still in the dating process, we actually started going to different churches to find a church to call home. And we also knew that we were going to get married, so we wanted to be able to have premarital counseling from a church. So we found an Assemblies of God church in Houston, Pennsylvania. And that was another one of those moments where it was a vision, a dream that actually confirmed that we were supposed to be there. While we were church hopping and trying out different churches, you find out that there are some just weird churches out there. And very nice people, but weird. And then there are other places that are great people and they're not weird. And because I was raised in quiet churches. So going to an Assemblies of God church where it's flowing in the gifts of the Holy Spirit and Pentecostal or charismatic in nature, people don't lift their hands in the church that I grew up in. They don't shout out. They don't speak in tongues. The first time I went there was actually with my best friend when we were 13, the first year we met. That was the only time I was ever in that specific church, but I had been there when I was 13. And I remember thinking that these people were crazy, like loud, speaking when the pastor's praying. I didn't understand any of it. But that was one of the churches that we actually went to try out. And because I have two small boys and they had a great kids program, a big youth program, so it would be a good fit for a family. And we attended, and then we tried a few other churches, and we had set to go back on a specific Sunday. And the night before we went, I had this vivid dream. And I dreamt, it wasn't the lead pastor, it was one of the assistant pastors that I saw in the dream preaching. And when we got there on Sunday morning, it was the assistant pastor who was preaching. So already that was something to me. But in the dream, this assistant pastor kept telling me, Revelation's in the middle. And that was the only thing he spoke, Revelation's in the middle. And I said, it's not in the middle, it's at the end, because I'm thinking the Bible. He said, no, Revelation's in the middle. And I'm arguing. And it was such an intense argument in this dream that I woke up from the dream and I ended up going back to sleep. But then just, a few hours later, we're in church service. And the assistant pastor gets up and he's the one that's going to preach. And he says, in your bulletin, there's the sermon notes for today. And he read off the title of the sermon, and I opened the bulletin and I look at the sermon notes, and there's only 3 points and Revelation's in the middle. So right then I looked at Rhoda, who wasn't my wife at the time, and I said, this is our church. I hadn't told her about the dream or anything. I just told her, I said, this is the church. And later I told her what I had dreamt and all that. But that's when we decided that's where we were going to call our home church. We started going through premarital counseling. I ended up joining the choir, and we got highly involved in the church. But we were still drinking here and there and going to the bar, and we weren't living a holy and righteous lifestyle. And because of circumstances, I actually had to change one room of the house to be a room for her because she couldn't stay in the place where she was because the ex-husband owned it and had massive debt, and I mean, it was a crazy situation where she had to declare bankruptcy, and it was not a good situation. So she didn't have any place to stay. And while I knew it wasn't right for her to live in the house before we got married, we compromised on that to where I made her own little apartment because there was a separate entrance on that side of the house because it used to be split into a duplex before I bought it. So she did live in the house for 7 months before we got married. But Rhoda was told for 15 years that she could never have children. And the doctors actually told her that even if she would conceive, she would never carry full term. So we ended up getting married, and then as soon as we got married, she became pregnant. And so obviously there was some fear there, but she carried full term, and it was the day before her due date. We went in for a routine doctor's appointment, and they couldn't find a heartbeat. So we're 1 day away from her due date. She carried the full 9 months, and so Xavier was born the next day, but he was stillborn. So the day that we went to the doctor's office and found out there was no heartbeat, they sent us over to the hospital to get an ultrasound done to confirm that there's no heartbeat. And then we get told, they have to induce her and she has to give birth. So I called our pastor and I told him what was going on. And he said, well, whatever time she gives birth, you call me. He said, I'll have my phone next to the bed and I'll come to the hospital. And it was early morning, 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning. And so I called him, and he was at the hospital within 30 minutes. And he prayed with us, and we were there. And that was a Friday. And Sunday morning, we were both in church. There's different moments in your life that you get to make a choice. Like you can shake your fist at God and be angry. When Xavier was born, Rhoda held him. She asked me if I wanted to hold him. I said no, and I stood there over the bassinet. Even though he was stillborn, they still wrap him in a blanket and bring him into the room. And so he's in the bassinet at the hospital. And I stood there, and I touched him, but I wouldn't hold him. And it wasn't until later that she asked me, why won't you hold him? And I said, because I don't want to take a chance on being angry at God. Like, you carried this child and gave birth. It was like, but I'm expecting to hold a live child in my arms, and I just didn't want to take a chance on stirring my emotions up and becoming angry with God because God didn't kill him. And so Sunday morning, we were in church, and the pastor from the pulpit, he talked to us, and he read about David. When David lost a child in the Bible, it says he was thankful when he could go into the house of the Lord. And so he was drawing the comparison between David and us, and he asked the church to come around us and pray. So we were in a church that seated about 600, and she and I stood up, and everybody's coming around to lay hands, and the whole congregation gets up and comes. And I see this group of people on the opposite side of the sanctuary, maybe 20 people. I'm like, that's weird. Why is there a clump of people that wouldn't come when the whole church came? And didn't think anything of it at that point. And after church, there was a gentleman that came over to me, and he said, hey, he said, I just wanted to let you know what happened during service. And I said, okay, what happened? And he said, well, he said, there was a man, when pastor asked the church to pray for you, he said there was a man that just started weeping, like weeping. And he said, so some people came around to console him. He said, and then he told us that he had lost a child 9 years before. And he had never gone back to church until that day. Not only was the choice to go to church immediately our breakthrough, but it was his breakthrough. I mean, even with that testimony, we were still in a state of depression, like I said, for a number of 6 months. But it was in that moment, it was immediate confirmation for me that we made the right choice that morning. You know, the last thing you want is, you know, within 72 hours, you go from a hospital losing a child to sitting in church service. It would be easy to stay home. But God directed that guy to come to get healed from his emotional pain because he was angry with God and didn't go back to church for 9 years. And it was that morning he decided not only was he going back to church, but I'm going to that church. And he said he had never even heard of our church before. He just felt to come to that church. And, you know, and the pastor called us out in the middle of service. If he wouldn't have done that, it wouldn't have led to that breakthrough. But God knew all those things were going to happen. And it would be for that man's good. But it was immediate confirmation for me that it was, don't run away from God anymore. Running to him is the answer, always. Obedience to God in the small things are because it says our steps are ordered of the Lord. And it's not our individual, it's our collective. Our steps are ordered of the Lord. He knows that his perfect plan is for you to do something. And he's already sent somebody else to either encounter you to encounter them to witness you in your obedience, what he's called you to do. Everything God intertwines. So he had instructed that man to do what he did, and that man was obedient for his breakthrough. But if I wasn't obedient, then it wouldn't have been the same result for that guy. Would he have received healing? Yes, I believe he would have received healing. It would have come through a different avenue because he was obedient. If we wouldn't have shown up at church, it just wouldn't have been as powerful or in the same way. But God would have still come through for that guy because he was obedient to come back to church. We weren't the parents we should have been to my sons, who at the time were 9 and 6. So, you know, they're dealing with parents who are divorced and a new person in the situation. And it was, there are things that you can't even foresee that you'll actually do. Like conversations that you wouldn't wish anybody has to have, but it was just reality. So we're believing, you know, she's carrying full term. I just want to paint this picture for you of what that year looked like. My sons are dealing with divorce of their mother and father, so they see their mother every weekend or every other weekend, because during the first year that we separated, I let her see as often as she could come see the boys. I wanted her to be able to spend time, so they were going every weekend. And so they're expecting a new brother. This is June 26th. They're expecting a new brother. The beginning of June, they get out of school. And it's only a few days later. They're in their summer vacation and are looking forward to possibly getting to spend a couple weeks with just their mom. And I got a phone call from my ex-wife's place of work. And they said, "Do you know where Rachel is?" And I said, "We're divorced." And they said, "Yeah, we know." I said, "Okay, then why are you calling to ask me if I know where she is?" She said, "Because nobody's heard from her or seen her in 3 days. She hasn't shown up, and that's not like her." And I said, "Yeah, that's not like her. She was driven for her job." And so I made a couple calls, and I found out that she was in jail. So now the boys wonder why they can't see their mom. She had a summons to appear in court, and she just didn't show up in court. So they ended up putting her in jail for 2 months. So I have to have this conversation with a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old that they can't see their mom for the next 2 months because she's in jail. But that doesn't mean she's a bad person. Sometimes people just have to go to jail. Like, I'm having this conversation with my sons. How do you make a child feel good about that? And then 3 weeks later, they're expecting a new little brother, and he's stillborn. So now they still have 5 weeks that their mother's in jail from that date, and it was not a good situation. Thankfully, Rachel's father, he loved spending time with his grandsons, and so he took them for 2 weeks and took some time off of work, and he actually spent a good bit of time with them. So it was good for them to be able to get out of the house, especially with the tragic loss of a child. And so that's where we were. But neither one of us were the parents that we should have been. And I know it was not an easy time for a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old to have 2 parents that were depressed and 1 parent that was in jail, biological parent. So after we lost Xavier, it was just kind of a somber, depressed atmosphere all the time. And we quite literally started playing video games all the time. Like, she and I were playing video games and letting the kids just watch shows and play video games. And if they weren't hungry, then we weren't really interacting with them. They were just kind of doing their own thing. And which, they didn't mind. They got to kind of do whatever they wanted, but it's not good parenting. And that's not how you show their kids that they're important. What you're showing them is that, what we were showing them in that moment was that losing a child we never knew outweighed spending time with children we have. And a lot of times people don't really see what their actions are speaking to other people, but as a child, that's what it speaks. And they just want our attention. They want to feel loved by us being engaged with them and them feeling important. So we definitely did not make them feel important for about 6 months. But it was about 6 months later where we're talking about the possibility of another child. And, I was worried about her mental state, because what if it happened again? That was literally the way I was thinking. And, I had no concept of spiritual authority at that point. I mean, even though we were in a church and we were growing and we were highly involved. I mean, at that point, before we lost Xavier, we were probably at the church 6 days a week, serving and doing all kinds of things. And whether it was being part of a small group or whether it was actually serving, doing things at the church. So we were growing in the Lord, but we still weren't fully, righteous and holy and uncompromised. And she got pregnant again. And it was like, overwhelming joy. So then we got an ultrasound done, and she found out that it was a daughter, and that's what she was always hoping for, was to have a daughter. And so there wasn't a question. She brought it up about possibly naming her daughter, our daughter, after her mother, and her mother had passed away from cancer right after we dated. So when she was in her early 20s, or when she was 21. As soon as she turned 21, her mother passed away from cancer. So here we are, and that's, another 10, 11 years later, and she's pregnant with a little girl, and she asked. So we did name Irene after her grandmother, and she carried full term. Everything was fine, and Irene was born in August of 2010, and everything seemed to be, there was joy again. Like, you're not worried about something bad happening, because now the baby's here, and joy's back. We're attending church, and everything's going well. And 9 months after Irene was born, I was on my way to work, and I was riding on my motorcycle, and I pulled up to a stop sign, and there was a young man behind me who was texting on his phone and hit my motorcycle from behind at a stop sign. And I suffered a pretty bad spinal injury. So I had 3 wedged vertebrae in the middle of my back, and I had a central protrusion choking off the spinal cord right at my waistline, my belt. So I was in excruciating pain. I was off work for 7 months. When I crushed a nerve in that accident, it wasn't the only accident that I had. I was in other accidents as passengers or driver, and my head's gone through about 4 windshields, and I've had several spinal injuries. So before the motorcycle collision, I had already had spinal injuries that had occurred. But for the most part, the nerve problem with that first accident, it was mostly okay. There were times that I would move in a certain way where I would have like an electrical pain that shot up my neck into my head, and it was terrible. But it was very rare at that point. But there was still some problem. It was bad enough that my daughter was 9 months old and I couldn't even pick her up. So that tells you the level of pain, injury that I had. So, and the 7 months that I was off of work, I was in therapy 3 days a week. So I'm in physical therapy 3 days a week trying to restore my body. And quite literally, the doctor told me, he said, well, the L4, L5 area, he said the L4, L5 area in your back is the place that wears out on everybody over time. He said, but essentially what you've done is you've pushed yourself 25 or 30 years down the road. And so what he was telling me was, you are a 35-year-old with the spine of a 60-year-old. And so, and like I said, I always had a tremendous work ethic. And that's when being involved in the church was a huge help, because we had friends, good people around us that could help us out. And we had a support structure. But there was, for me personally, it was a really bad time for me as a man. Just feeling worthless, and I couldn't work to provide So let me back up for a second. Because um, we had lost a child, and because she had been told she could never have children, when she was able to have a child, and Irene came along, we knew she was going to be a stay-at-home mom to be able to raise Irene. Because what's the point of having a child, miraculously being able to have a child, and then you're going to put them in daycare all day while you work? So both of us had come to the conclusion that she was going to stay home. And so she stopped with her career and stayed home. She was a full-time mom. And so when I got hit on the motorcycle, we had no income. And the insurance company, whenever I had purchased my insurance for the motorcycle, I said, I want the motorcycle insurance to be written exactly like the car insurance that I have. And I know that the car insurance has lost wages on it. Well, I came to find out after I got hit on the motorcycle and can't work that the motorcycle insurance did not have lost wages on the insurance policy. So now, not only am I off work, can't work, she's been out of the workforce now for a little bit of time, and we have no insurance to cover our wage loss from me not being able to work. And so I couldn't do things around the house. I couldn't help, and I couldn't even take care of the kids so that she could do it. So I really felt worthless as a man. And I remember we had just planted a big garden, and I was so frustrated with the fact that I couldn't do anything. And this huge garden that I had taken the time to till all the ground and plant, and now my wife in that situation was taking care of the kids, doing everything, and the Lord met all of our needs. We weren't in danger of a house being foreclosed on or anything like that. We always had enough to pay the bills and scrape by with just enough. But I wasn't bringing money in personally, and I couldn't even go out and work in the garden. I couldn't help with the kids. It was just laying around and going to physical therapy. And so I got frustrated one day, and I took a big bowl outside with me. We had a lot of bean plants. And I remember that Rhoda looked at me and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going out to pick beans." And she said, "Are you sure you should be doing that?" I said, "I'm going to figure out how." So I went out to the garden, and I couldn't really bend over to pick beans off the plants. So I literally laid down on the ground in between the rows of plants, and I put the bowl above my head, and I laid in the dirt, and I picked the beans off the plants and put them in the bowl above my head, and I'd push the bowl and wiggle down through the dirt on my back. And that's how I picked the beans in the garden, so I could at least do something that made me feel like I wasn't a worthless human being. And because that's what I felt like. I felt like there was no, my wife had to do everything. I couldn't do anything. And I'm not making any money to support my family. And I've got 3 kids. So for me, it was a tough time. And then I had to humble myself to ask guys from the church to come and cut my grass because my boys weren't old enough to cut it. And I mean, that's when I really got humbled. Like, I really learned humility through that stage of my life. With finances for the home, like I said, while I was off work, God was supernaturally supplying everything we needed. But I couldn't work, and I couldn't even collect unemployment. I couldn't collect unemployment because you have to be able to work. And I physically was unable to work. So I couldn't collect unemployment either. So we were in this weird position. So I started doing just odd jobs. So I was collecting scrap metals, and I'm going to get money for scrap metal, and that's how we were able to buy groceries on a consistent basis. I was able to run scrap. And then it got to the point where I had to have a job. So I had to really start looking to find something that I could do, because I couldn't lift heavy objects. I really couldn't lift much at all. And then I was even stuck where I couldn't even take a job as a security guard, because either you have to sit for long periods of time or you have to stand for long periods of time, and I couldn't do either one of those for a long period of time. So I had to have something where I could sit when I needed to sit, stand when I needed to stand, because there's no telling how long I could stand or not. Because what would happen was that central protrusion, it was actually choking the spinal cord off. So depending on how I moved and the level of inflammation, sometimes I would lose feeling in my legs as I was walking. I would just get this terrible pain. I mean, there was pain all the time, but then I would get this piercing pain, and I would have no feeling in my legs. I almost smacked all the teeth out of my mouth one day walking to the sink, because I got 2 strides away from the sink, and one of those pains came, and my legs collapsed, and I went falling toward the counter and grabbed the counter before I smacked my teeth on it. But it was things like that where how can I find a job where I'm not going to be a risk to everyone around me and myself? So the casino, there was a casino that had just been built, and I put in for the surveillance department, and I didn't know anything about casinos or casino games or anything, but I put in for the job and I interviewed for it. I ended up getting the job, but the surveillance guys are watching all the cameras, and they're in their own room in their own building. They're outside of the casino. So I could kind of sit, stand, walk, do whatever I wanted inside the room as long as I'm watching cameras. So it was ideal for the situation. I didn't really have to lift anything, controlling, typing and controlling a joystick. So that's what it was. Christmas, just a couple days before Christmas was the first day I worked. Or I'm sorry, it was a couple days after Christmas was the first day that I started working for that casino, because I was in the hiring process the week of Christmas, and then it was, I think, December 29th of 2011, I finally got employed again. So we went from the beginning of June until the very end of December with absolutely no consistent salary coming in. The casino, I've never worked at a place that had a heaviness to it like that place did. There was 1,500 employees and not one happy person. Everyone was miserable. And some of them were making great money, but you could see it, you could feel it. So it was depressing to be there. And whether you can understand it or not, I had to see all the worst things that the world has to offer happen. Some people think it's all about jackpots and money flowing everywhere. Well, it's also about people being intoxicated and fighting and puking on machines and doing things that you would never see anywhere else. And then when they happen, not only do we see them, but then I have to make a video and then verify the video. So I have to watch the thing happen at least 3 times and write a report on it. And so there was this, in that time, it was like the devil, when it says that he comes to steal, kill, and destroy, steal your joy. But the destruction, he'll try and bring it however he can. And that job, you have to mistrust everyone. Your whole job is to trust no one, even the employees. Because in a casino, most of the time, employees are in on whatever's going on. So if somebody's really trying to steal from the casino, then there's an employee involved. So our whole job was to not know anybody there. And there was a team of 15 of us and 1,500 employees. So you're not really allowed to talk to anybody in the casino outside of your department, and you're not supposed to trust anybody. You're supposed to be the one that watches. And so there was this, as I went through a couple years at the casino, I could see that with my wife and children, all I could see was the negatives. The only thing that would stand out to me in behavior was the negative, because I got paid to watch the negative all the time. And so that started affecting me, and I could see it. I mean, I could tell it was affecting me. And also, you know, from a man perspective, I had a debilitating spinal injury where I was in pain all the time. And as a result of that, intimacy inside the marriage was near non-existent, because I physically could not be intimate without a lot of pain. And I didn't want to take drugs, but to put it in perspective, the type of pain I was taking between 3,000 and 5,000 milligrams of ibuprofen every day for 3.5 years after the accident, because I didn't want to be on narcotics. And so over-the-counter medications, I was taking enough that it should have destroyed my kidneys and my stomach. And it wasn't even really taking the edge off. It was just making me able to function. So in that process, the devil was able to work like in the background, because now there's no intimacy. And it wasn't because I didn't want there to be intimacy. It was painful, right? So, but then it turned to pornography and masturbation, because you can't have intimacy the way God designed you to have intimacy because of your situation. So that's, but one is no excuse for the other. But I just want to show you how even when you're moving toward God, you know, something happens, and the devil is just trying to. It was that I was never in God's perfect will. That's why the devil still had access to me. And because I had compromise in my life, I didn't have full spiritual authority to stop him from attacking me and doing all these things that was happening. So there were problems in the marriage resulting from many things being out of balance and sin being present. But it was a loving marriage. It was just that the pain stopped intimacy, and then the job that I took at the casino was working overnight. So I left the house at 11 p.m. I got back to the house at 8 a.m. So if you look at the years that we spent married, less than half of those nights did we sleep in the same bed because of injury and because of the job that I worked. So not only was there lack of intimacy, but there was not even sleeping in the same bed because we're sleeping at different times of day. And so it's challenging. I mean, and that's one of the things that we talk about in our ministry with people is, if you're working a job overnight and you can't sleep in the same bed with your spouse, that's the first thing that needs to change, because that's not the way God has it for you. And he doesn't want you being on opposite shifts, never seeing one another, never seeing your kids the way you should. So, and now I'm starting to preach in the middle of telling my testimony, but I just want to be transparent on how those things happen. It didn't mean that we didn't love one another. It's just that the situation was completely out of balance, and then it caused problems and sin to arise in different areas where you wouldn't have thought there would be. So in the Assemblies of God churches, as in general, we were there from early 2008 until 2015, mid 2015. And in the Assemblies of God, they do have the gifts of the Spirit at work. So there is speaking in tongues and laying on of hands and prophecy and all those things, which were not things that I was raised with. So I was still resistant to a lot of those. But being there for a long period of time, I was open to the move of the Holy Spirit. It took a while to open my eyes. Being open to meant I didn't think the people around me were crazy. I could feel the presence of God, and when people were speaking in tongues and praying in tongues, I understood that it was real for them. It's just that I had not fully received it for myself. So it was hard for me to, you can't comprehend it until you encounter it, really. So in church, people laid hands on me in the past, and I never fell out under the power or anything like that. But I had a lot of years of preaching that I grew up in that preached against it. That speaking in tongues and praying in tongues, that's the devil, and these people laying hands on people, they're just smacking people in the head and knocking them down, and but I could see it on a consistent basis at church, and people would fall down, and I knew that they weren't being knocked down, and I knew and respected many of these people, so I knew that they weren't going to just do it for the sake of doing it to make somebody feel good. So I knew something was happening. It just never happened to me to that point. And then Evangelist Jonathan Shuttlesworth was coming to our church, and that was, he did 21 days of prayer and fasting for his ministry every year. And the assemblies wanted to take part in that, and they were having him come in. He was scheduled for 3 weeks through January and February. 3 of those weeks. So the first week of the year was actually the first full week he was doing meetings at the church. And I was still working at the casino. So if I went to the meeting, they were in the evenings, and I was told ahead of time that this guy had long services. I knew I was going to have to leave the service potentially before it was over just to go to work. The good thing was I was 4 minutes from my work when I was at the church. So the first night that I went in, though, I had been asking about this guy. And they were just like, oh, yeah, there's healings in his services, and people were falling out under the power of God, and he moves powerfully. And I was like, okay. So I came into the service essentially with the motive of, I'm going to find some way that I can disagree with this guy. That way, I don't have to feel bad about not coming back, because I would usually sleep and then wake up right before I had to go to work. So for me to attend the services, it meant that I had to change my sleep schedule and be awake to go to church. And then by the time morning's rolling around and there's nothing going on at the casino, I'm falling asleep at my desk. So I was looking for a way to disagree with this guy so that I could just say to my wife, I'm not going back. So, and I still was in constant pain. I wasn't looking for healing. I wasn't looking for supernatural healing. I didn't want the pain. I wanted my body well, but I wasn't in a place where I could believe for it. I didn't have the faith to believe for it. And so the first night that he came, we usually would sit in the second row when we sat in services in that church. And the only seats open were in the very front row. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Now I have to sit right in the front row. And There's no buffer in between anymore. Now he's right there. The pastor's really close to us. And so Evangelist Jonathan Shuttlesworth was preaching, and he kept bringing the Word of God. And he's tying it all together. He brings the Word of God, he makes his point, and he says, well, if this is true, and this is the truth of the Word, then let's look at this in context. And he's tying all these things together. Stuff that I had heard preaching against all my life. And I wanted to disagree with him, but I couldn't. Because it was the Word of God, and I had a knowing that he was right. Because I knew Scripture, because of the way I was raised. So those years that I was raised in the church and had all that Word in me and memorized all the Scripture, it was beneficial at that point. But I wanted to argue with him and disagree with him so I could stay home. Right? So he starts ministering to people, and he's calling people out, and he's laying hands on people, and I mean everybody's going out under his power. Everybody he's praying for is going out. And in the past, in regular church services, a person here or there, and it's always the same people that fall down, right? So you can say, oh, well, maybe they just fall down all the time because they think that's the thing you do. But now I'm seeing everybody. Even the people that don't normally fall down are falling down. And he ministers to a bunch of people. And we're 3.5 hours into the service, and it's almost the time that I need to go to work, right? And he points at me on the front row, and everybody else, he had said, stand out here in the aisle, raise your hands, right? And then he's physically laying hands on them. He looks at me, and he says, come here. He said, stand up there on the platform. And he points to the middle of the platform where the band plays from, where the preacher stands. He tells me to stand there. And I remember vividly, as I stood up, I was taught to be obedient and quickly obedient, right? Especially in church. That's from the earliest memories. You just did what you were told in church. And so the obedience part was there. But in my head, as soon as he said, stand up here on the platform and face the audience. Okay. And I remember walking up the steps onto the platform, and in my head, I literally was saying, this is not going to go the way you think it's going to go. I do not fall down like the rest of these idiots. That's literally the thought that was going through my head. I'm speaking it. He can't hear it, but I'm speaking it in my head. And I get on the platform, and I'm standing there, and one of the pastors came around behind me. And I remember looking back at him, and Evangelist Jonathan was still speaking to the crowd at that point. And I remember looking back at that pastor and thinking, there is no reason for you to be back there because I am not falling down. And I was partially right on that. I was completely wrong on the first thought when I was walking up the stairs that it wasn't going to go the way he thought it was going to go. It went exactly the way he thought it was going to go. The part about there's no reason for you to be back there was because I didn't fall down backwards. But after Evangelist Jonathan spoke to the crowd for a minute, he turned around and he starts speaking to me. And he said, raise your hands, close your eyes. And in my head, I'm trying to listen to him, and I'm still having thoughts of, if this guy comes and lays hands on me, I'm not going to believe he didn't knock me down. He's telling me to close my eyes, right? And he got 3 steps away from me, and as he spoke, he snapped his fingers, and he wasn't close enough to touch me. And it felt like a fist this big punched me right in my stomach. And, I told you I took a lot of years of martial arts. I have taken some heavy blows in my life. Kicks. I mean, I've been thrown across a room by getting kicked in the face and the stomach and everywhere else. And it was one of the worst hits I've ever taken. Like, I mean, no denying something, a power struck me. But he wasn't anywhere close. And I buckled in half, but fought to stay standing. And he came over and he spoke again and touched my hand like this, just touched my hand. And I crumpled to the ground on my face. And my daughter was 4 years old, and she asked her mom, "Did Daddy die?" So if I can give you the visual of what that looked like, I was right that the pastor didn't need to be behind me, because I literally crumpled to my knees on my face on the platform. And I knew at that point that God was real, the power of the Holy Spirit was real. I was having an encounter with a power that has the power to touch my physical body and the insides of me, because it wasn't just my flesh that was being impacted. And I mean, the flesh reacting was just the reaction to my entire being encountering the power of God. And I remember being face down on that carpet on the platform, and the first thought was, this is real. And then the next thought was, what else did they lie to me about all my life? All these preachers who said that this was the devil, and I knew it's not the devil doing these things. This is God. I'm encountering God. And so that was the first night. So now I know I'm coming back for services, right? No matter what I have to do, even if I had to be late to work, I'll risk it, because now I just found out that the power of God's real, and I encountered it for the first time. So the fourth night, he did an altar call, and Irene wanted to go up for the altar call. She raised her hand for the altar call, so I went up with her, and we're sitting on the steps of the platform, and she's on my lap, and he goes through the sinner's prayer, and after the sinner's prayer, he says, anybody that needs healing in their body, he said, wherever you have pain, you put your hand there and raise your other hand to God. He said, and when I pray, God's going to touch you and heal whatever it is. And I remember as soon as he said it, I thought, it can't hurt. And I put one hand on my back and raised my other hand. Because in my head, what I was thinking was, 4 days ago, I didn't believe in getting slain in the spirit and falling down, and the power of God physically makes it so that you can't stand on your feet. That's why people fall down. And if that exists, then the power for immediate healing may exist too. So why not do what he says? The last time I was obedient, I had breakthrough. So I put one hand on my back. My daughter's still sitting on my lap. He prayed. And when he prayed, it was like a light switch. 3.5 years of excruciating pain in my back. And it was like somebody turned a switch off. There was, some people say they get this warm feeling or whatever. It was literally like shutting the power off of pain. And when you're in pain that long, I mean, you kind of get used to it being there, but you know it's there all the time. But the pain turned off. And I was afraid to even speak out that it happened, because I didn't want it to go away. So it was like 3 days before I even told my wife that I had been healed. And I came in the room, and I physically did some things that I couldn't do. And she said, yes. And at the time, like when she said yes, like asking a question, I thought she didn't understand, but it wasn't that she didn't understand. She actually wanted me to speak it out. And so I spoke out. I said, I'm healed. I have no pain. It's like, I'm healed. And so I mean, from there, it was, my eyes were opening to all these things. You know, and at the same time, there's still part of me that was resistant to part of Evangelist Jonathan's preaching that I was hearing that week too, because he spent a lot of time teaching on sowing and reaping and the offering time. And that was out of the ordinary for me. And I'm like, what is this guy so wrapped up in money and wants everybody to give for? And, you know. But it was the first time, like, I don't think ever in my life that I gave more than $100 in an offering, ever. I was raised to understand what tithing was, and we had just started tithing right before Jonathan had come to the church. But we started tithing because I was convicted to tithe again. And we could see the change just from the tithing. But as far as offerings above the tithe, it was just meager, just here and there, little bits. So never given anything substantial. And so it was the second week when he returned, which was towards the end of January, and he kept saying in his offering message, and you spell thousand, THOUSAND. And I remember thinking, yeah, like people were writing you thousands of dollars worth of checks all the time. And my wife at the time said, I think we're supposed to give $1,000. And we only had $2,000 in the bank, and it wasn't enough to pay our bills for the month. And I was like, okay, I'm going to pray about it, which is the religious version of saying that's not going to happen. And but I said, I'll pray about it. And I sit down, and as soon as I sit down, one of the ushers came over and asked me if I could help take the offering. I'm like, oh, okay, fine, yeah, I'll help you. So I'm standing in the back, and the last thing I had told to my wife was, if God wants us to give $1,000, he'll have to speak very clearly. And I'm standing there as one of the ushers in the back of the church, and Jonathan opens up his Bible, and he says, turn to this passage. And he starts reading, and he says, Solomon sacrificed 1,000 bulls. And this is not a joke. I mean, there's people sitting, I'm standing there, you know, and I went, give me a break. Like, out loud. And the guy next to me just looks up, gives me this crazy look. But I wasn't speaking it out to him. I was speaking it out to God. Give me a break. Like, I said you'd have to speak clearly, and you just did. So now I know that that's what I'm supposed to do. So we did give 1,000. And I don't think it was that night. I think it was the next night, because I was still, like, holding on. And he came back 3 weeks later. So now we just gave away half of our net worth, essentially, because we only had $2,000 in the bank. Gave 1,000 away. But it wasn't giving it away. It was sowing it into good ground. It was seed, right? And he comes back 3 weeks later, and we gave another $1,000 because we had $6,000 in the bank, and it didn't come from my salary. So we gave 1,000, paid our bills, and had $6,000 3 weeks later in the bank. So we gave another 1,000 because I'm not stupid. So if the power of God is real and the healing power of God is real, and now I find out that the sowing and reaping part is real, the multiplication, that's real too. Okay, well, now you've got me. Like, now I've just been able to prove in a 2-month time it all works. And that's where the true breakthrough in my life started coming. So, you know, I was born in 1975, and here we are in 2015, almost 40 years later. I was 39 years old. And that's when I finally figure out what I need to figure out, the real stuff. Shortly before encountering Brother Jonathan, we found out that the reason that there were behavioral issues between my oldest son and Irene's mother, Rhoda, was because from the time that Rachel had left, she was telling my sons that that Rhoda was the reason that we divorced. So Graham saw my wife as the reason that his mom was no longer in the picture. So he resented her. And there were a lot of behavioral issues and strained relationship between Graham, my oldest son, and Rhoda. And it was shortly before encountering Jonathan that it all came out. So he was about 14 years old, and it all came out. And she was just trying to love him the best she could, but it was a very strained relationship. So they actually started having a better relationship between 2014 and 2016. And so, especially after Jonathan came, it had impact on the whole family, not just on me. And so after encountering Brother Jonathan, everything started changing. Like, the family truly started growing in Christ as a whole family. And we started understanding what you could have, the spiritual power and authority of a believer, because we encountered the power of God. And it was truly life-changing of the direction it took us in. And Graham and Logan were in Bible quizzing, where they were memorizing entire books of the Bible to do Bible quizzing. So it was a developing time for them, getting a lot of word inside of them. It was something that was enjoyable, and they were able to interact with many kids their own age in the church. So everybody was growing, and it brought the family much better into unity and into a loving relationship with one another. And obviously lies were exposed and things were able to be revealed. And everything seems to be rolling along well. At that time, too, I knew that I wasn't supposed to stay at the casino anymore, because now there's no reason for me to be there. I had my physical healing, and the reason I was there, that I took the job, was because I didn't have it. And I felt the Lord speak to me in June. It was May or June of 2015, 2015, to quit my job at the casino. And I didn't have another job to go to. I just knew I was supposed to quit. And at that same time, we were making the switch from the Assemblies of God. We felt God speaking to us to go to the church that Brother Jonathan attended, which was Champion Christian. At that time, it was actually called New Life. But he attended a church in Canonsburg where we lived. So when he wasn't on the road preaching, the church he sat in, the pastor he sat under, was that church. And so in the beginning of 2015, he also did 3 different weeks in that church. So not only did we go see him in our own church in early 2015, but we also went to that church. So we ended up getting to know the pastor of that church, and we felt God leading us to make that church our home. And so at the same time I was quitting my job, we were making the switch from the Assemblies of God to go to Pastor Nathan and Joey Miller's church. And we're there. We were attending for about 2.5 months, and I told my wife at the time, I said, you know, I don't have any clear direction on what God wants me to do, so I'm just going to tell the pastor on Sunday that I can start volunteering or something, at least do something. I've got the time. Maybe I'll just go volunteer at the church. So we get to church Sunday morning, which was only 2 days after I spoke that out. And in the bulletin, it says they're hiring a part-time cleaning person for 7 to 10 hours a week. And so I asked if I could put my application in, and they said, sure, you can put your application in. So I put my application in, and they hired me to do cleaning. And so I was literally vacuuming the church, cleaning toilets, and that's what I was doing, 7 to 10 hours a week. And so I would ask them, I would say, hey, is there anything else you would like me to do? And there were a couple little things that he gave me to do, one of which was cleaning out the basement of the church office, which hadn't been done in quite some time. And he figured it would be a multiple day challenge to get accomplished. And they were having their staff meeting that day. So I'm working underneath of where his office is on the first floor. It was an old house converted into offices, and joined the church building. And so I'm up and down the stairs, I'm moving stuff around, and I'm a very spatial person. So I can see a room full of junk, and even if I don't know what can get thrown away, I can just see how to bring order and what'll fit where and how to make things better. So 3.5 hours after I walk downstairs, they're ordering lunch because their staff meeting's almost done. And I came upstairs and I said, yeah, I'm done. If there's nothing else, I'll head home. And he goes, you're done? And I said, yeah, I'm done. I said, there's a lot of stuff that I don't know whether you want me to throw out. I said, it's all over in this one corner. And he said, oh, I'll come down and look. And I don't think that he believed that I was done. But it was orderly and clean. I mean, clean. And it's an old concrete floor, tons of dirt everywhere. And everything was in great order. Like his eyes were big when he walked downstairs. And I know that's the moment that things started changing, because they started giving me more hours. And before 2 weeks was up, I was there 20 hours a week. And so 7 hours turned into 20 hours in a couple weeks. And within 2 months, they created a new position and made me the facilities director. And I was there about 35 hours a week. And it wasn't long after that they turned it into a salary position, and I was full time. So when God told me to quit my job and I had nothing to go to, I actually had put in for other jobs, and I actually had started working a job 4 days before I took the cleaning position at the church. And the hours that they told me it would be, I said, I need off for this because I have to work at the church. Because I didn't have any income, so I needed the income. But I literally was there for a few days, and I knew it's not what God had for me. And so the one day I went into the boss, and it was only after a few days of work. And I said, look, I know I can't continue doing this. I said, the hours are not what you told me the hours are, and they're conflicting with the other thing that I have. I said, and everything in me wants to keep this job because it pays better. I said, but I know that's not where I'm supposed to be. And so I left, and all I did was the church, and that's when they offered me the job full time. This is August of 2015. I'm full, I started working for the church, and before Thanksgiving, before October, November comes, I'm already full-time employee. At that same time, Rhoda had it on her heart to go and volunteer at one of the big crusades that Jonathan Shuttlesworth was doing in Philadelphia. And that was a supernatural testimony of provision in that situation. And she went and served. So in in 2016, she was still volunteering here and there for Revival Today, Brother Jonathan Shuttlesworth, and I'm working at Champion. And so she's still technically a full-time stay-at-home mom, but because Irene was getting to school age, she was able to go and volunteer a little bit. And she actually got hired at Revival Today in March of 2016. So she went and she was just volunteering in the office, and she volunteered for 3 weeks straight. And the person in charge at the office came to her and said, "We would like to hire you, and we're going to pay you for the last 3 weeks." So all of the time that she was volunteering, they actually paid her for. I mean, what fantastic people, and put her on staff. So she was on staff there until June of 2016. And in June of 2016, there was an issue that she was let go. And it was challenging. And I only knew what she told me. I mean, that's my wife, and I love these people, I trust these people at Revival Today, but I can only have the information that she gives me. I don't know anything else. So she was saying that she was fired without cause, is essentially what she was telling me. And she wanted to file for unemployment, and I said, absolutely not. We're not filing for unemployment against a ministry. It was like, that, we're just not doing it. And it was a long time later that I found out that in August of 2016, she actually, without my knowledge, sought an attorney and filed for unemployment without me knowing, against Revival Today. And that's not good. You don't do that. So that's the situation. I'm just trying to explain to you what the situation is. So it's like touch not mine anointed, right? With David and Saul. But in 2016, Irene turned 6 years old in August. My sons were 13 and 16 at the time. And Rhoda had not been employed with Revival Today for 3 months, but Brother Jonathan was holding an event, a crusade in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and the youth from our church was going to go and help with the Friday night service. And because at that point, Rhoda had started being involved with the youth at the church, she wanted to go to the event because the youth were going. And in me, I did not have peace about her going. I didn't think it was proper because she had been let go from Revival Today, and now this is a Revival Today event. Even though it's our youth going, I didn't think it was right for her to be inserted in that situation when they're trying to do an outreach. I didn't know what the dynamic would be like between their staff and her. And so I didn't really have peace. And in the end, my oldest son was going to be playing football that night. So he was going to be right down the hill from the house playing football. And it was actually our night as parents of football players to supply food before the game for the players. So she had to deliver food to the football field and then get Logan to the church so that he could go for the event. And it was at that point that she asked me if She said, well, what if there's not enough vehicles to take the kids? I said, look, when you go to the church, if Logan can ride with someone else, then let him ride with someone else and you come back home. I said, if there's absolutely no one else to drive and there's extra kids that have to go, then you can drive down. Logan can ride with you and you can take the extra kids and go. And so Irene and I stood on the porch and we're waving just because, I figured she'd be back in 10 minutes after dropping Logan off. 10 minutes later, I get a phone call that says that there's not enough room for all the kids. There's not enough drivers. So she's going to fill the van and take kids. She's going to drive to West Virginia. I said, okay. So it's about an hour and a half to Clarksburg. And about an hour after they left, I was talking to her on the telephone. And she said, we're going to stop for fuel. And we're only, 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from the church. After I stop for fuel, we'll only be a short distance from the church. And I said, okay. I told her goodbye, and they stopped for fuel. And obviously, I found this information out after the fact, but they stopped for fuel. Everybody gets back into the van. They get on the highway, and quite literally, they drove maximum of 90 seconds down the road. And as they went down the highway, a box truck coming the opposite direction crossed the center of the highway, hit the van, and it killed everyone on everyone on the driver's side instantly. And everyone on the passenger side walked away from the accident. It's very minor injuries. So Rhoda and two of the girls from the church were killed in the accident. So all I know at this point is that I'm sitting on my couch. So that's the information. But the situation I was in was I had talked to her on the phone 20 minutes earlier. She was about to stop for fuel. And we were also fasting. So we were doing the midnight to 6 fast. We're only eating the evening meal. And so it was just after 6 p.m. I had heated up some chicken nuggets for my daughter to eat at 6 years old, right? And I thought, well, I'll just make a few extra nuggets and I'll eat them myself because I haven't eaten, and this is my chance. So I literally had taken 2 bites of food, and I had a bite in my mouth, and the phone starts ringing, and it's an odd number, a West Virginia number that I didn't know. And I picked up the phone, and it was a man on the other end of the phone, and he said, I just want you to know that two of the girls are okay. Your son and 2 of the girls are okay. Because it was actually Logan's voice that I heard first, and Logan said, Dad, we were in a crash, and there's a man here, one of the firefighters wants to talk to you. So he was using just some guy's phone, and he hands it to the firefighter, and the firefighter obviously walked away from my son, and he's on the phone with me, and he said, I just want to let you know your son and 2 of the girls are okay. He said, but I don't believe your wife's going to make it. And, in that moment, like, I've got a bite of, I'm listening on the phone, and it was my first opportunity to eat. So it was quite literally the second bite of chicken nugget that I had just shoved in my mouth. And when he said that, like, it's a rush of emotions. Like, there's no way anybody could prepare for that. And I said, okay. I said, I want to talk to my son. And so I spoke to Logan again. And I said, where's Mom? I want you to go lay hands on Mom. And he said, I don't know. They won't let me see her. So the truth of the matter was she was already killed. So she was, when he got out of the van, he got out of the van on the passenger side. And all of those who had died were off to the driver's side of the vehicle. So he didn't see them. And somebody grabbed him because they saw everything, and they pulled him off so he couldn't see anything. So he had no idea where she was or what was done. And so now I've got to go. I've got my 6-year-old daughter. And so I threw Irene in the car, and we jumped in the other car and took off for West Virginia. And I didn't even know how many people were in the vehicle. I didn't know who was in the vehicle. I didn't know how many people. I just knew that there were other children besides my son and my wife that were in the van, because that's why she was driving down. And so there were 2 teenage girls and my wife, Irene's mom, that was killed at the time. And then the other 3 were also two teenage girls. And my son that survived, and quite literally, they were all out of the hospital within 6 hours. And from the wreckage, you wouldn't have thought that anyone could survive, but it was supernatural that they were really untouched. The worst injury was a 2-inch cut above the one girl's eyebrow for the survivors. That was the worst. But I drove down to West Virginia very quickly, only to find out that, everyone that was killed instantly and was never even taken to the hospital. So, 1 month exactly after my daughter turned 6, and her mother's gone. So when we get down to where the hospital was, I had the GPS on, and we actually had to be detoured because they shut the highway down. So immediately they had shut the highway down, so we had to get off and take a detour and got to the hospital. And as soon as we got to the hospital, I went in, and I get to the main desk, and I asked and I asked for my wife by name to the lady at the desk. And she says, I don't have anybody by that name in my system. And so then I gave her my son's name. And she said, he's in this room in the ER. So I went with Irene into the ER. And as I walked down the hallway of the ER, I see there's a couple police officers standing and a couple nurses, and I see my pastors, Pastor Nathan and Joey Miller, and they had their daughter with them, who was a little bit younger than Irene, and there's this other lady, older lady, standing there. And as I'm approaching, the lady asked who I was. She asked the pastors who I was. I could hear it from a distance. And as I approached, she said, I would just like to tell you, I'm the chaplain here at the hospital. And she said, I've been with Logan the whole time since he arrived, and he doesn't even know that his mother's gone yet. So that whole drive, I'm standing in faith that what I believe has been spoken, right, by the guy, that he didn't think she was going to make it. I could, even on the drive down, I was praying in tongues and trying not to drive super fast because I had my 6-year-old in the car. But there was one point on the drive down, we still had another 40 minutes to drive, and I literally got a picture of her laying on the ground. And so I knew she was dead. And I was even commanding life into the body at that point because I could see it. And so when I arrived, I already had a knowing that she was gone. However, it's kind of abrupt when somebody comes and tells you, and he doesn't even know his mother's gone. And my pastors didn't appreciate her doing that and rebuked her because I didn't know. But I promptly left the hospital and drove down to the accident scene and walked clear into the accident. And so there were two investigative officers that were standing on the side of the road, and I see all these lights set up. And I had actually arrived. I had arrived about 3 minutes after the point where they uncovered everything so that they could take photos. And so I'm marching into where I can see all the lights and see all the wreckage. And as I'm walking in, they saw me. From a distance, I couldn't even tell that the wreckage was a minivan. And then when I got closer, I could tell that it was a van, but I couldn't tell that it was my van. It was that destroyed. And there was another random car off to the side that had nothing to do with the accident. It actually had occurred a couple days before, so it didn't make any sense to me the way things were. And but I walked up within 10 feet. They were standing right at the two officers were standing right at the front of the van, and directly behind them I could see a body laying in the grass. And in my mind, there was nothing that was going to stop me from getting to my wife. And the one guy you could tell he didn't know what to say. He was standing like this. And the other officer, he's looking me dead in the eyes, and he said, please don't do this. Please don't do this. And I'm on a mission. And I was actually picking up speed because I was just going to knock him over. And as he said the third time, please don't do this, I had told you I didn't know who was in the car. And it struck me as odd when the guy called that he said 2 of the girls are okay. So when he said the third time, please don't do this, out of the corner of my eye, I realized there was a body laying to my right, and there was a body laying up in the grass. And I could tell that it was my wife behind them. So, like, I was gripped. What stopped me wasn't him. What stopped me was the reality that there were 2 other families that lost a daughter. And me reacting badly wasn't going to be good for anybody. So they were very nice officers. And they both put their arm around me to control me without controlling me. Like, not in a forceful way. They just wanted to make sure I moved in a specific direction. And they started taking me away. And he said, please. He said, this is a criminal scene. He said, if you touch anything, you disturb evidence. And all I wanted to do was lay hands on my wife and, at least pray for raising from the dead. And but at that moment, when I saw out of the corner of my eye the 2 girls laying, it just took all the fight out. But yeah, I got back to the hospital, and Then I had to tell my son that Logan, who had a very good relationship with Rhoda, I had to tell him that that Rhoda was dead. And at the same time, I had to, on the way down, I had to coordinate with my sister because the plan was that, you know, I would still be home. I could go down to the football field that was only a couple minutes from the house and get my son after his football game. So now I'm not going to be able to be there to get him. And after I got to West Virginia, now I realized that I'm not going to be home at all for the night. I mean, my son would have to spend the night somewhere. So the people that I originally called to be at the field to receive him, who are from the church and I trust, I mean, spiritually trust also, it wasn't going to be a good option for that. So I had to call my sister, and I said, hey, I need you to pick Graham up from the football game and tell him that he's staying with you overnight, that I decided to come to West Virginia and we're going to not be home tonight. I said, that's all he needs to know. I said, but do not turn your radio on and don't let him watch any TV, because the crash had made national news. So even that night, it had made national news. So it was on the radio, it was on the internet, it was on so I said, don't let him look at his phone, don't let him watch anything. So I was there. My parents had come down to the hospital. They were there by the time that I was able to tell Irene and Logan that Rhoda had died. And they released Logan at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So he left, and I think it was closer to midnight. He left, and he went with my parents. My parents took Logan and Irene back to their house, and I was still at the hospital. But at that point, I said, okay, I'm just waiting for them to clear the wreckage from the highway. I want to go down and make sure that there's not anything personal that's left on the site for, the news to get or somebody else. So I wanted to be able to be there as soon as they opened the highway to go down and check things out. So I went back down to the crash site, and I did find a few notebooks from the teenage girls and a purse and different personal effects that were missed by the police because it's dark. But being at the crash scene after everything had happened was a little more than I'd anticipated emotionally. So that night, I'm driving back from West Virginia at 3 o'clock in the morning. I got back to the house 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and Graham, my oldest son, who stayed with my sister, had an early morning football game on Saturday. So now I have to drive to my sister's house to get him, and I have to give him the news. And it wasn't just that Rhoda died. It was 2 of his friends from school and church that were also killed. And the one of the girls that died was a girl that was in our home a lot. We actually tutored her, and we'd take her back and forth to church because she lived with her grandma. She's a child that her parents were addicts and they weren't present, so she was in our home a lot. So it was people that he was close to. So not only am I telling him, hey, your stepmom died, who he had just started getting a good relationship with after years of not having a good relationship, at 6 a.m., I'm having to tell him and give him the option of whether he wants to go play football or stay home. And it was I told you there's situations that you get in where you have to have conversations that you never thought you'd have to get into and never prepared for. And I was thinking that telling my boys that their mom was in jail and wouldn't be able to see them for 2 months was the worst conversation that I would ever have. And it pales in comparison to the conversations that you have to have. So he ended up playing football that day. And in hindsight, the coach said he probably should have told him not to, but he had statistically the best football game that he's had in his entire football career that morning. He had lots of negative energy he wanted to get out, and he had more tackles and more blocks than he ever did before that. So it was good for him to be able to vent a little frustration on the football field, even if it was at the expense of the other young men. But it was a long night. Like, I was up straight through for 48 hours, and yeah. So it was a long first week. I mean, really, because it was criminal investigation, and there were mandatory autopsies for everyone. It happened in another state, so we didn't even know when they were going to release the bodies back to us. So we couldn't plan anything for funerals. And so now there's 3 funerals that have to take place, all for the same church family, And so late Wednesday night, they actually released the bodies. So we knew we can move forward with scheduling funerals. So it happened on September the 9th, 2016. It was a Friday evening. And the following Saturday is when all of the funerals were. And I think I was the only person that did. But I attended all 3 funerals because I let the families with the young people make all of their arrangements, and then we made arrangements so it wouldn't conflict with any of them. So at 9 a.m. I was at a funeral and reception, and then I went directly to another funeral and reception, and then I went to the funeral for my wife. And it was just as long of a day as the the day that it happened. Emotionally draining, but my kids grew up with these girls. They attended our church. They were our church family. Their families were, our families. We love them very much, and there was no way that I was not going to go to the funerals of these young girls. I just didn't think that it was the right thing to do to not go. And I mean, it's how God convicts you, the direction He tells you to go, right? Because in some way too, you feel responsible. It was my vehicle. But the reason I felt responsible was because I had no peace to let her go. And then I should have just told her no. Because that's what I believe God was telling me, was to just say, no, it doesn't make sense for you to go. It's not the right setting for you to be in. And so some part of me knew that I should have not allowed my wife to go, period. And because somebody else would have stepped up and taken Logan and the other girls that needed to go. It was just tough. I was the facilities director of a church. I was working way more than full-time hours, trying to accomplish everything. And I did, about 2.5 weeks, I took off from the church. It was a solid 2 years of putting my daughter to bed every night and her crying for 30 minutes to an hour saying, I miss mommy, and there's nothing you can do. It just breaks your heart on their behalf. And Graham, my oldest son, he was hard on himself because he spent so many years with a strained relationship with her, and then the relationship began to heal, and it was actually a healthy relationship. And he was hard on himself because he wasted time. There was a point where Logan, when you survive something like that, then you start asking different questions, in your own mind. And there was a point where Logan came up to me one day and he asked me, he said, Dad, what would you have done if I died too? And I said, well, I would be even more devastated than I already am. I said, and I love you very much, but today would still happen, and I still have 2 other children. In that, I wasn't telling him that life goes on. I was telling him that there's still, just because people leave the earth doesn't mean that we stop living. And that's what I told him. I said, look, I owe it to my children. If they just lost a parent, I said, I can't live like I died too. I still have to function as a parent, as a loving parent. And so it was tough. And there were trying to schedule everything. I didn't sign up to be a single parent of 3, 6, 13, 16. I'm trying to still get everything done. The boys are in all the activities at school, and Irene's getting bigger. And I ended up in April of 2018, I started dating a woman in the church that, it wasn't God directing me to date her either. A lot of it was that I was lonely. It's tough. But she also had 3 kids, and it was not ideal in the least. And it was only about a month later that it was just after midnight on Mother's Day of 2018 that I got another call. It was my son, my oldest son, and he called me because he was trapped in the car. He had just gone off the road and hit a tree. So I was thankful that he was calling me and not a emergency personnel. But he, it was raining. He was a young driver. It was late night. The car slid off the road, hit a tree. It totaled the car. And I don't know if he realizes how close to death he was with the way the whole accident happened. But quite literally, he almost lost his left foot. The tire came all the way back and through the door and into his ankle. They had to cut him out of the car, and when they lifted him out of the car, his foot was almost detached from his body. And at that point, I was already there at the scene. So that was another one where I got a phone call at midnight, and I had to take my daughter. It just so happened that Logan was staying at a friend's house, so I had to wake Irene up so that I could take her with me to go get my son, who called because he had just crashed the car. And so it was a really bad situation. And so I spent the majority of the next 4 months being his nurse at home, because he had 4 surgeries and 4 major surgeries on his leg. And he spent a bunch of time in the hospital and then a bunch of time hospitalized at home. And I was his nurse, having to give him shots and everything else every day. And so it was a really tough time. And for Irene, even that, having to be woken up and taken out to a crash scene was crazy. She was 7 years old and a year without her mom, and now she knows her brother's in a crash, and I'm waking her up in the middle of the night. But it also has to do with still not living perfectly righteous life. You know, there's lots of people who have hidden things going on, and there was just, I hadn't cleaned my life entirely up. And at that point, I had fallen back into pornography. I've been out without a wife for 2 years, and you open doors where the devil can come in and mess with you, and he's going to go after the people that matter to you. It's not always just attacking you. Like, he wanted to destroy the whole family. And you know, you owe it to your children and your spouse to live a righteous life, just to be able to protect them. So that was the start of a wrong relationship, and Graham being in the crash and all that. Graham ended up graduating high school from a wheelchair because he had so many surgeries. He still couldn't walk at his graduation. He had to be in a wheelchair. And I was in that relationship for over a year, and I knew it wasn't the right relationship. I knew it wasn't what God had for me, but I was ignoring what God was speaking because I was lonely. I needed companionship. I needed a helper, but I was more a help to her than she was to me. Still trying to be a dad, but we had all kinds of little issues. But ultimately, there was I got a true wake up from Irene as to why I ended the relationship with the lady from the church. Because there was the day where I was in the car with Irene, and we're just driving, and it's a normal day. And she said, "Dad, do you like spending time with me?" And I mean, I thought I was going to swallow my tongue. I got this rock in my stomach. And I said, "Of course I like spending time with you. Why? Why would you ask that?" And she said, "Because it doesn't seem like we do it anymore." So this woman that I was in a relationship with, like I said, she already had 3 children. One was a very small child. When we started dating, he was 9 months old. And he was 2 by the time the relationship ended. But she had a daughter that was a year older than Irene, and then a son that was older than that. And this daughter that she had never had a father in her life. She had never known her father. So here you have a girl that's over the age of 10 that's never had a father in her life. So over time, while we're dating, it was Irene, the devil was lying to her to believe that I liked this woman's daughter more than I liked Irene. And it's all just lies from the devil that he can come in and destroy the children and relationships and all that. But when she said, "Do you like spending time with me?" it hit me hard. And it's not a joke. As soon as Irene was out of the car, I made the phone call. And it was a very abrupt ending to the relationship. I literally said, we're done. I said, I started to explain to her, and she didn't take it well, but it was the right thing to do, and I did it. That was October of 2019. And in January of 2020, for the fast, from October of 19, that's when I really started getting my life in order. But at that point, Graham, my oldest son, had already left and gone to live in South Carolina because he no longer wanted to live in my house because he didn't want to live by my rules, which was the same type of thing that I did at a similar age of not wanting rules to govern my life and not wanting to live under my parents' rules. And so Graham was already in South Carolina. So it was just Logan, Irene, and I at that point. And Logan was actually talking about going to live with his brother. So everything at this point is seemingly not going well for the family. And I really started pressing into God. And then when the fasting and prayer, 21 days of fasting and prayer came to start 2020 off, I really was pressing in. And I'm also the facilities director, and Brother Jonathan Shuttlesworth was holding his twice-a-day meetings for fasting and prayer in our church. So, and by the way, in all this, our church got given a second campus. So now I'm taking care of 2 facilities, 2 campuses. I have double the work and still no spouse. And I was working, a lot, 80, 90 hours sometimes. And I would work through the day. I would come home, make sure the kids had dinner, get them to bed, leave, go back to the church, work most of the night, come home, get some sleep, be back up for the kids to get them to school. And it was a project of just making the day work. So Irene and the boys were home without me quite a bit whenever I was at work. And so 2020, I started pressing in, and Brother Jonathan was preaching, and he said, he started talking about spouses. And he said, if you get in the will of God, and I actually wrote this in great description in my book, but he said, if you get in the will of God, because he was telling his own testimony, he said, God will bring that proper helpmate right alongside of you. And I was standing in the back of the room. So when he's pointing, with the lights on him, I'm sure he couldn't see me, but he was pointing at me, speaking strong. If you just get in the perfect will of God, God will bring that spouse right alongside of you. And that's how you'll know it's your spouse. And I said, at that moment, I was like, okay, God, I hear you. It's like, I don't care how long it takes. If it takes years until you show me that it's my spouse, I'm done looking for a wife, and I'm just going to wait till you bring her. And I was very serious with God, and I prayed that. And that was the first week of the fast. And then Pastor Mary Furlong from Prayer Center in Switzerland, Evangelist Kofi, who was a dear friend, man of God who works for Brother Jonathan. He's the one that Brother Jonathan hired to pray 4 hours a day for his ministry. Brother Kofi had been preaching in Switzerland at Pastor Mary's church, and she came in. They came in the second Sunday of January 2020, and so it was like the 9th or 10th day of the fast, and she was coming to spend the rest of the fast at our church with Brother Jonathan, and I didn't look at her like a wife. I just prayed and told God, I'll wait. I wasn't looking for a wife at all, and she wasn't looking for a husband, and but she came, and through the fast, God spoke, and we both knew that the other was our spouse. And at the end of the fast, we started dating. We dated 3 days. On the 4th day, we got engaged. And 19 days after that, we were married. And within 3 weeks of being married, the entire world shut down. What we thought could never happen, happened. And so here I am, 2020, a 45-year-old man who's getting married for the 3rd time. And it's, when you tell people that, they look at you funny. But, I had a wife who left me, and then, who left me because she wanted to leave me. And then I had a wife who left me because she died. And now I'm remarried. But now I'm actually in the place where God wants me to be, which is living the way he wants me to live, not being compromised, being righteous and upright and having right standing with him. And it's a whole different ballgame. And so he brought her, and then he spoke to each of us, and we got married. And here we are. I said earlier, I told my mother I was never getting married, never having kids. And I marry a woman who's never been married. She's in her 40s. And I'm in my 40s. And she gets pregnant as soon as we're married. And Joshua's 2 now. And it is a glorious life. God, I feel bad for my wife because while I'm telling you all this story, I told you that in 2005, my best friend, that we were living in his house, and I had to buy a house. So I bought a house. That was 2005, before my first wife left. She left. And then I got another wife who lived in that house. But financially, I was in no position that I could get rid of that house. So literally, this woman that God brought me, that is the right wife for me, now she's got to come into a house where I've had 2 previous wives. Mentally, for a female, that's got to be, I don't even know. I don't even know what to call it. But it's not a good thing. And we were just following God on everything, being completely obedient to the leading of the Holy Spirit in everything we did and all the decisions we made. And God has blessed us over the top, instructed us in November 2020 to move to Florida and to be here at the River Tampa Bay Church and to establish our ministry here in the States. And life today does not look like any of my life before 2020. And it's not that God didn't give me the chances. He was giving me the resources. I just wasn't using them. And in 2015, he was opening my eyes. It's just that I was resistant to change. And But then, once you make that switch to actually do what he wants you to do and live the way he wants you to live, everything will change. And that's what happened. My life dramatically changed for the better, and the lives of my children changed for the better as soon as I got into his perfect will and did what he wanted me to do. So as we sit here doing this interview, this is June of 2024, and Irene is a big help with us in ministry. She's currently 13 years old. Joshua is approaching his 3rd birthday, but he's still about 2 years, 9 months. And we're just full speed ahead for everything God has for us. The family is writing books and working in ministry and doing everything that God wants us to do. We're still overseeing the church in Switzerland that is now a River Church and affiliated with the River Tampa Bay Church. And our ministry, Truth Revival, is thriving, but more importantly, our family and the individuals in it are in the perfect will of God, and that's how we have peace and joy and abundance.